Hello, 022 and the rest of you. This is a really quick video and it's okay, boomer. I've heard that phrase a lot, and the one thing I want to bring to you, and I couldn't wait to get to the 1950s to talk about this, is the boomer generation. And it's really about the booms. Okay, now what do I mean by that? There was a famous historian named James T. Patterson, and he published for the Oxford Historical Review a very famous set of investigations, and what part of it dealt with what he called the booms. And the booms are those events that took place in his mind after World War II, such as birth. The birth increased, and now so we call them the baby boomers. Life expectancy increased, okay? And then the other things started to increase from this generation, such as college education, the GI Bill, more people coming out of World War II specifically, but not only, had access to education as never previously before. And the GI Bill was a wonderful way. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, which it was officially called, and later on dubbed the GI Bill, put millions of people into college. It also helped put millions of people into work. And what really was behind this is the United States government. Let's be real clear. Whenever you get into the idea going back to the New Deal in the 1930s, and the argument came out to what the government should and shouldn't do, and we discussed that and wrote an essay on it. The clear picture really came back to the idea that in FDR's imagination and mind, it was very important that the government had to play a role. And here we are today. So there's really no difference in my mind whenever you start looking at it. In fact, Dwight David Eisenhower, a Republican, not an FDR Democrat, who even said anybody in any party that says we're going to cut Social Security, we're going to eliminate anything that came out of that New Deal program, he said they will no longer be a party. The boom generation, or the booms as James T. Patterson called it, also had to do with housing. And this was also later on going to be a very important thing for government. So the intricate nature between the government and the individual, what did it yield? The booms. And what were the booms about? The middle class. It was the old saying that the rich got richer and the poor had children. And this is probably still true, but the middle class. The growth of the middle class in the 1950s was probably one of the most important hallmarks of the American democracy. Yet it wasn't all good, because we're going to move towards McCarthyism, and I already told you about McCarthyism. I kind of jumped ahead to that, but I'm going to back end it this way. When you think of that period of time and you think of McCarthy, that was the true tragedy. That's the true thorn in the side of the growth of the American democracy. This is why it's a civil rights movement also. The generation that was the boom generation would later on, those baby boomers, the generation that was born in those eras in that period, would later on be involved in Vietnam. And that would also dissect that group of folks. Okay, and that group of folks would then either go off to fight in Vietnam in order, in their minds, to do a noble deed initially, to save a nation from communism, to promote the American ideas of democracy. Although we'll get to Vietnam later on, I like what Newt Gingrich said, and I'm just going to be honest because it was a good line when I first read it. We designed a war and we lost it the way we designed it, basically, and I'll come back to that later on. But this baby boom generation also is the generation that later on would create the counterculture generation. And this counterculture generation was also the generation of Vietnam. And they saw as making the world a better place, this idealistic view. And we still live with those two parts of it today. The tragedy of what was the 1950s was that prosperity wasn't even. And I'll come back to that housing market again. One of the people to look up is Bill Levitt, Levitt. This is where you get the term Levittown. Bill Levitt was an old Seabee, if you remember that. The people who used to go into in the Navy, go out and construct and build very quickly on the islands out there, became known as Seabees. And Bill Levitt said, what I'm going to do when I get back to the United States after World War II is I'm going to build these homes. And he had a methodology, which is basically what I call a Walmartization. It's an assembly line of building homes. And he made them affordable, but not for everybody. While Bill Levitt was a fantastic engineer, he was not a very good social engineer. And so what lagged behind in the 1950s and into the 1960s is the ideas of America, those values. And those values are what McCarthy stood against. And people stood up against McCarthy. McCarthy now, you got to understand, politicized things quite uncomfortably for Dwight David Eisenhower, if you remember that, but also for other members of the Republican Party. And what I admire was a woman named Margaret Chase Smith, excuse me, who was a Republican out of Maine and stood up and actually spoke out against McCarthy. And her speeches are worthwhile to Google and look at. Margaret Chase Smith was probably one of the last moderate Republicans. And I thought that was important because to be a moderate, as Lincoln was, meant to think for oneself. And that's something today, when we look at our crisis today, is the booms. And when you think of the booms, that boomer generation is a generation to admire. And it is a generation to model in a lot of ways. And even though the younger generation looks at the older generation and either accepts or rejects what they were about, there's a consistency regardless. And the consistency goes back to 1776, goes back to 1787. And even those gentlemen in that room had problems with each other. We always argue that we're a Hamiltonian or a Jeffersonian, whoever we want to, admire most. But in either case, when you think of the American ideals and the principles, there seems to be a common ground. And those gentlemen of 1787 did find a common ground, even though they didn't agree all the times. And so when you think about it, that boom generation, booms as Patterson said, gave birth to something very, very important, which is really the heart and the bloodline for any great democratic system in my mind, or free enterprise system for that matter, the middle class. And so even though not everybody shared the same prosperity, and that was something the civil rights movement was about, still is about. And so here we are in this current crisis, and the need for government is just as much. I think one gentleman said it the best I heard on a recent talk show, and it was just filled with wisdom. He said the Americans are about to find out just how bad they need their government. Okay, and here we are today. So hopefully, hang on, those government checks are coming. Think wisely what you're going to do with it, and hopefully you're safe. But think of the booms. Okay, boomer. Okay, you guys have a good day. Bye bye.